refer to this as community lawyering, social justice lawyering. I think these terms are similar and related. This is a very long quote that I'm not going to read, but the idea behind it is that when the pandemic happened, a lot of community and movement groups saw that as an opening, as a portal, as a way to, and it's not that movement lawyering, community lawyering didn't happen before the pandemic. It absolutely did. But the pandemic was sort of another reminder that there are cracks in the edifices of the way systems work, systems that are typically very oppressive and restrictive to people who are marginalized and vulnerable, right? Which is often what movements are trying to do. They're trying to work within and with vulnerable and marginalized communities to make the law and the systemic the systems that control all of our, or that we all have to intersect within our lives, more accessible or more helpful. So that it's just a reminder that there are unlikely results of things that sometimes can be opportunities. Okay, so one question I wanted to make sure we discuss before we hear from Jared is, what does it mean to engage in these types of lawyering? The social movement, the movement lawyering, the social justice lawyering, the community lawyering. What does it mean to engage in that kind of lawyering based on your reading? Yeah, you say yes.
It's like breaking down the hierarchy and really connecting with these grassroots organizations and with actual clients that I'm in this position where I went to law school, I have a law degree, so the information has to be funneled to some standardized way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge piece of movement lawyering. And one thing I'm going to do really quickly is just make sure. Jared, can you hear when one of my students just said something? Could you hear that?
Yes, I heard him loud and clear.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you all for speaking up. So yeah, that's right. That's a key feature of movement lawyering is the eradication or the attempt, or at least the awareness, if not the eradication, at least the awareness about hierarchies that typically exist in the law, and then an attempt to eradicate them or attempt to not function in that way. Yeah, that's right. That's a key. What else? Based on your reading. Yeah, Connor.
It's the study of movements in a non-traditional sense, rather than like attenuated, you join these organizations, you actively listen, you try to comprehend and understand their lived experiences, and then bring that to the legal community.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. And that's also super important, right? So one piece of it, and actually goes hand in hand with what Isai said, is only if you don't think of it hierarchically that you actually don't think of it in terms, don't create a distance between yourself and the individuals and communities that you're representing. And this is still, I think, a very novel idea in the legal world. The idea that you go become a union member, go join, and spend some time within the union to see how the structure works, to see what things are important to the people within that organization before you start coming up with, in order to inform really your strategies for how to lawyer in the best interest of those communities. Yeah, great. What else? Yeah, Lizzie.
It requires having an awareness of how arguments you're making at an individual level for any given client have systemic ramifications. So I don't have a concrete example, but even minimum wage advocacy, you advocate for individual clients to receive minimum wage, the more that minimum wage becomes sort of the default standard. So thinking about things like that.
Yeah, that's fantastic, right? That's something that lawyers rarely think about, right? We're mostly only thinking about, and actually our ethical rules sort of require us to really stay focused on the individual client that you're representing and doing everything in your power to get that individual client the thing that they want. And as Lizzie pointed out, doing that, well, it definitely, you're adhering to your ethical obligations to that client, you may be definitely ignoring the systemic issues and maybe even creating conflict with those systemic issues. And I think what Lizzie is raising too is at the crux of suburban sweatshops, which we'll talk about later in the course, where there's this tension, at least the way the law has been set up, there's this tension between individual rights under the law and communal rights, or communal, or whatever the communal good is in any particular situation. I mean, another example I was thinking about as you were speaking, Lizzie, was this issue around settlements, right, which we do a lot of with our clients. So many of our, and we've talked about this before, when we talk about settlements, many employers want confidentiality agreements. They don't want the workers to be able to talk about the fact that they settled, certainly not how much they settled for. But that diminishes the communal worker power that might exist, because we know in most of these workplaces, our client's not the only one who's being taken advantage of. And actually, Kevin and Isai are in the thick of that right now, where they met with like 20 people, or you heard about it last week in rounds. And there's more at that workplace. So that's another example of where these things can be at odds. Yeah. Any others? In the interest of time, I'm just gonna, if I can find my cursor, just I'm going to go through, and you already mentioned most of them. So as Connor mentioned, working alongside, I know there's a way to get rid of these things, but I'm not gonna take the time to do it right now. But so and working alongside and embedding in community groups so that you're co-generating ideas, right? It's again not that top-down structure where just the attorney is saying, here's the claim we should bring, here's the legal strategy we should use. Instead, it's very much informed by the community's goals, which may be different than legal goals. I think that second one sort of goes with that, is that where lawyers are part of that organizing effort, or at least, if not part of it, understand that organizing effort. And that's hard to do, right? You're all going to have very busy legal practices, and actually having a foot in both of those worlds, I guess what I'm trying to say is you each will have to decide for yourselves, if you go into this type of work, where that balance is between being too overloaded. For many years at the clinic, I had a fellow, you've all seen him on the videos for the Big Havana, and he used to be a board member at Southside Workers. And that was the way that we did this piece, is that we always had a presence on the Southside Workers Center board. And then when he left, they asked me to be on the board. And I wanted very much to be on the board, but I said no, I couldn't be on the board because I had too many other commitments at that time, and actually every other time since then. And I regret that a little bit. I regret that I wasn't able to be a active participant with that group, because that synergy between what we do and what they do is very valuable. And we have it, but we don't have it in the same way, I think. Okay, investment, political, economic, social justice. I think that goes without saying. Most of you are already, there, especially if you're going to be doing this work. And then a little bit of this next one is what I think Lizzie was talking about a little bit, is that understanding that these are systemic problems and they're intersecting, and understanding where individual rights and the systemic issues begin. And that's, again, something that most lawyers don't have a lot of time to think about. You're so focused on your individual client's case, and you all know this. You all know this from the work that you've been doing. It takes a lot of time and energy and focus just to do the legal part of what you're doing. So to be able to take a step back and see how it fits into the systemic geography of these issues is not easy. I do want to say that I think it is easier if you are in community with other like-minded lawyers. I mean, it's one thing certainly to be embedded in community organizations and community groups, and that's very helpful. But I think that if you're going to do this work, if you can surround yourself with other lawyers, even if they're not in your same organization, doing that work, that will go a long way towards continuing to be able to see the systemic elements. And that's something I think is more possible now than it was when I was starting out as a lawyer. So I think that's good news for all of you who want to do this. Okay, and the last one I think is something we've already talked about. I'm going to just blow through this pretty quickly. I was just saying, I just want to point out that this is not new. This type of lawyering is not new. It's been going on for a very, very long time, and it has influenced all of these movements throughout U.S. history. And then the 2020, what I call twin pandemics of both the COVID pandemic, but also this racial injustice didn't start with COVID-19, but there was this big consciousness raising around it that happened. It was somewhat akin to the consciousness raising in the 70s, right, in the 60s and the 70s, where again these issues have come to the forefront, and and again spotlighted why this type of lawyering is so important. And then these are just a list of the many, many systemic issues, and workplace rights is one of them, but it's also related to all of these other systemic issues. That's important to keep in mind. Okay, so this is kind of the last piece I want to talk about before Jared talks to us, which is how we've already talked a little bit about it, but how do you engage? Like, what concrete things? How do you engage in movement lawyering? What concrete things can you do? Connor already talked a little bit about, going and joining a group or sitting in, but what other concrete things can you think of? And many of you are already doing it in your client representation. Do you want me to tell me what I'm thinking instead of making you guess what I'm thinking? So we've talked about this. You talked about this accompanying rather than always needing to be as a lead, because I think people who have legal education are sort of naturally looked to as leaders, and I think there's a good reason for that. But we are also restricted in how, most of us, in how we think about things. Actually, many of you probably came to law school being able to think in lots of multiple frames or whatever frame you came from. But then when you come to law school, a lot of people see law school's job as sort of like whacking away all those things and making everyone think in the same mode. So this is sort of you're going to go backwards. You're going to kind of unwind that a little bit, where you let some of these other ways of thinking back in. But until you do that, you may not want to take the lead all the time, because you're going to see things in a very specific way. And that can be frustrating for community and movement groups. And I've had that experience. I've had personally that experience working with community and movement groups where they are trying to fix something. And as a lawyer, I rush in and say, well, here's the legal thing to do. And they find it sometimes to be quite myopic. And it is, So this is harder to do than it looks, I think. This accompanying, not leading. Learn rather than wield professional privilege. That's very similar. I think this one is really a good one to keep in mind, this redefining of success. So you're all in this right now with your cases too, right? ACRD negotiation, mediation didn't end up with settlement for your client. And many other situations, and we look at that as, sometimes it's hard not to look at it as a loss, right? Oh, it's a loss. I didn't do what I wanted to for my client. Connor, I know you've had some of those feelings too about your situation. But in the movement lawyering space, there can be this other way of thinking of success, which is around this collective work. The book I know I've told you about it before. I posted on D2L about work won't love you back. There's a section in that book so in that book she interviews all of these different workers from these different industries to talk about how all those industries are exploitative, and basically all industries are exploitative and late capitalism, according to her, pretty the author of this book. But in any event, what's really interesting is at the end of each of these chapters, each chapter is sort of capstone with the story of one particular worker in each of these industries. And each of these workers, you hear them say that, yeah, we had loss after loss after loss, and maybe a tiny win, and then whatever, more losses. But that what they really came out of their movement work that they were doing with other workers, solidarity with other workers, was this incredible feeling of solidarity, and that they weren't alone, and that there was still a fight to fight. So that, I think that's important. It's also important for public interest lawyering, because you will have a lot of losses, and so if you can, and again, this goes back to knowing other lawyers who are doing this work, so that you have a sense of success within the solidarity that you have with other people doing similar work. And then this last one, which is the one that I was referencing, that I think all of you have already been doing in your client work, which is to engage in deep listening and stories of the community groups, of the marginalized and vulnerable populations that you're actually trying to help and assist. Even if you might come from those groups, some of us come from those groups, but because we've moved through the legal space, there is this separation that's occurred. So this deep listening, I think I can't overemphasize. And I think you've all either, have that skill or learned that skill, and you've all exemplified that skill through your work in the clinic. The article also talks about locating resistance, locating where that resistance work is happening, which is not always easy to do. Like, Connor's saying, well, it's good to join a movement groups and good to be part of there, go and attend meetings. But sometimes it's like, where do you go? Who are you going to reach out to? Now, law school environment, you have some sense of that, I think. But when you're out there practicing, it's not so easy. So it's just know it can take time to identify where that resistance is. We already talked about thinking and working alongside communities. Shifting to episteme, again, I think that's something Lizzie was talking about, where you're not looking at it in individual rights way, but also more systemically, and adopting a solidaristic stance, which is just, it could just be in your head, right? It could just be what you think of when you wake up in the morning, like, I'm in solidarity with other people who are doing this work. But just that reframing for yourself can be helpful. So we talked a little bit about, I've already talked about this, locating resistance, being aware of, the sources of this work. I don't think I need to tell you to make sure you don't forget to look at the virtual space. Oh no, it's happening again. Attending meetings, we talked about that. Oh, but the one thing I did want to mention that the article touches on, but I feel it could do a deeper treatment of, which is that you also don't want to be looking at movements and communities as sort of the answer either, right? Like, you're together kind of come up with answers to all of these systemic problems. But movement lawyering can be really frustrating also because movement groups are not going to speak in a singular voice. You have to have a high degree of tolerance for dissonance, I think, which lawyers are not particularly good at, right? We try to avoid dissonance. We kind of want to, this is the answer, this is the argument I'm making. But that's really not how movement work occurs. There are lots of different voices, there are competing voices, and that goes back to the listening. You have to spend a lot of time listening. But it can be messy, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And then I think we've already talked about this. And there was a great example about the Fight for 15 in the material, that how that movement has incorporated many of these movement law strategies. So hopefully you took a look at that. And I'm not going to, I think I'm just going to stop now because I think we've already talked about most of this. Yep. All right, great. So I'm going to stop right there so that we can now hear from Jarrett. Jarrett is going to introduce himself, and because he has a wonderful introduction that he had already planned. So all I'm going to say is I met Jarrett Brown, who's here with us today, who's generously giving up his time to come talk to us, because he is currently an MLS student, a Master in Legal Studies student at the University of Arizona College of Law, and the MLS students also can take some of the BA Law student courses, or I guess I should say the BA Law and the MLS program have joint courses. And Jarrett was in my Introduction to Immigration Law and Policy course that just ran in the last 7-week online period. And he was hands down one of the most outstanding students in that class. But what struck me about Jarrett was his engagement around, I do just a little bit on employment and labor in that course, not very much. But he was so interested and engaged in that area because he comes from a very much, you'll hear, workers' rights, movement kind of background. And so I asked Jarrett if he would come and speak to us in today's class because I felt like I'm telling you a little bit about the theoretical underpinnings of movement law, and that's what you read in your reading. But Jarrett's going to tell you about the real life movement work and potentially movement lawyering that all of you can engage in once you've graduated. So I'm going to let you just tell us, just talk to us based on what you want to, what you've planned, and then if people have questions, do you want them to hold them until the end, Jarrett, or is that what we talked about, or do you want them to ask throughout the talk?
We can do it either way, but if you're going to be short on time, it might be good for me to just get through it. Whatever you're most comfortable with, I can work with you.
Okay, excellent. So I think we have until 3, so hopefully that'll be, that's an hour. So I agree with you. Why don't you go through the whole talk, and then when you're finished, we'll open it up for questions.
Sounds good to me. So, thank you, Professor Desai, for inviting me to your class today and the introduction, and hello to all of you in the class. Thank you for letting me join and listen in. Hopefully, one day I'll be in a classroom just like yours, at your level and the JD level, if everything goes the way I hope it'll go. So we'll see about that. But believe me when I tell you, I wish I could be there in person. Of Of course, I want to meet all of you and shake your hands, but it's been a long, cold winter here in Wisconsin. I'm in Green Bay. So I wish I could be in Tucson soaking up the sun. I used to live there back in the early 2000s, and I loved it there, and I still love every chance that I have to go back and visit. Professor Desai is a thought leader on many of the issues that I'm going to be discussing today. I told her that if I were pursuing a JD at the law school, I would be sitting in the front row of all her classes and trying to get into the clinic. As students at the University of Arizona, we're fortunate to be able to learn from and collaborate with people like her. It's an honor for me to have the opportunity to be with you and to share my experiences as a worker and a non-attorney advocate for workers' rights. I'm looking forward to hearing your views and fielding your questions during the discussion we'll have after I wrap up. Let me tell you a little bit about myself so that you'll better understand who I am, where I'm coming from, and why I'm here with you today. Currently, as Professor Desai just said, I'm a student in the Master of Legal Studies online program through this law school. Before that, I was a factory worker, activist, and writer. It's an interesting combination, but that's my life. I've worked in construction and food processing plants as a union steward and as a newspaper reporter, among other things. I'm most proud of having defended the rights of seafood processing and meatpacking workers for over 15 years. During the pandemic, I was very vocal about the working conditions in the plants that made possible the COVID-19 outbreaks, which caused thousands and thousands of people to get sick and hundreds to pass away. I've been featured in newspaper and online articles, radio segments, political print ads, and digital and TV political ads about issues affecting workers. My op-eds are often picked up by widely circulated publications, and I've been mentioned in the Atlantic magazine, as well as quoted by the Associated Press, USA Today, and the U.S. News and World Report. I've provided pro bono consultations to the University of Wisconsin, Institute of Public Health, and a county health department here in Wisconsin about how to keep workers safe during the pandemic. I've also spoken to several political groups and to a class of MBA students at St. Norbert College about workers' issues. That was an interesting experience because I went in there and told them things that they weren't expecting, and or that are kind of different from the way that they think. But we ended up all kind of coming to agreement on a lot of the main issues about how employers should treat their workers. But the first university I ever spoke at was the National Mining University of Ukraine. Though it's outside of my main topic, I want to say that I stand with the people of Ukraine and that all Americans and those who cherish freedom should too, because the Ukrainians are fighting to protect the future of democracy for themselves and the world. We should show solidarity with the Ukrainians because what is happening there and has and will continue to impact the rest of the world, both directly and indirectly. That's all I'll say about that, but I will return to the ideas of interconnectedness and solidarity in a few minutes. As I mentioned a second ago, I'm a student in the MLS program, so I'm not coming today as a lawyer or as an authority on the law. I'm not going to tell you how to lawyer either. If I say anything that sounds like that's what I'm doing, please forgive me and know that that's not my intention. In your law clinic, you're concerned first and foremost with legal rights. I assume that you also want to protect all other rights that workers have, whether there are legal remedies or not. A question you've probably already discussed this semester is, where do workers' rights come from? For me, the easiest way to answer that is by talking about the framework for the employer-employee relationship. The way I see it, there are three parts. The first part is the law. Obviously, there's legal codes, statutes, ordinances, government rules, government regulations, government orders, and court decisions. The law tells us what our rights and responsibilities are. You all know all about this because that is what the clinic is all about. Generally, it's ethical to respect the legal rights of others. The second part is agreements. These could be union contracts, written agreements, verbal agreements, unspoken agreements. I was thinking of past practices when I wrote that. Employment advertisements and employment contracts. I also include company policies in this because employees are basically agreeing to be bound by company policies when they accept employment. Agreements tell us what our rights and responsibilities are. If the elements of a contract are present, an agreement may be legally enforceable. Generally, it's ethical to respect the terms of agreements and to uphold your end of a bargain. The third part is morals. By virtue of our humanity, we have certain rights. Society, our upbringing, our religions, or our cultures, our customs, our traditions, and our value systems tell us what is right and what is wrong. Morals tell us what our rights and responsibilities are. Rights derived from morals may or may not be codified. Just because something is legal doesn't necessarily mean it's moral, and just because something is illegal doesn't necessarily mean it's immoral. By definition, it's ethical to follow principles or rules that are based on morals. So, what do workers want or feel like they deserve? They want employers to treat workers fairly and with respect by providing just compensation, good benefits, safe work areas, and a pleasant or at least non-hostile work environment where their voice matters. They want democracy in the workplace. They want employers to respect their legal rights, their bargained for rights, and their rights derived from morals and ethical principles. Now, with all that out of the way, I want to share the narrative that led me to become an advocate for workers' rights. In the 1950s, my grandfather started a tile and marble installation company in Charlotte, North Carolina, that's still in business today. My grandfather earned a reputation for quality craftsmanship that attracted new customers and increased his income. The tagline of the company was "Tile with Style." He thought that was smart. In the 1970s, my grandfather became distracted by expensive hobbies like riding horses, restoring cars, flying airplanes, and developing real estate. Since my grandfather was preoccupied with his hobbies, my uncle became involved in the financial side of the business. My uncle realized that as the Charlotte area grew and became more affluent, there was a potential for the business to bring in many millions of dollars. Instead of thinking strategically about how everyone involved in the business could benefit from it, my uncle thought strategically about how he could take over the business and use the profits to benefit himself and his side of the family. When I was a kid, my father would take me to work with him when school was out. I remember how on Friday mornings, old African American men who worked for my grandfather in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s used to come in and talk to my uncle who ran the business in the 90s and 2000s. The men would always ask my uncle for money because they never made enough to save anything and they didn't have retirement investment plans. My uncle would give them money even though he knew he would never get it back. They really needed it, and you could argue that they deserved it. During that time, I became keenly aware of the ways in which employers sometimes take advantage of, mistreat, and abuse their employees. In the late 1980s, my father had a wife and 3 kids at home. He had to work hard to put a roof over our heads, clothes on our backs, and food on our plates. My uncle understood the predicament that my father was in and used it to his advantage by becoming our landlord and the owner of my father's truck. Regardless of how little my uncle paid my father or how much he berated him, belittled him, or cursed him, my father couldn't quit. Because then he wouldn't have a house, he wouldn't have a job, and he wouldn't have a truck. My father took pride in his work and always created a quality product for the customer, but he hated his job because he hated the way he was treated by his brother. After graduating high school early in December 2003, I entered the workforce full-time out of necessity. My uncle gave me a job as an apprentice to an experienced tile installer who would help turn me into a highly skilled professional. I was appreciative of the opportunity to learn the same skills as my grandfather, uncle, father, and many other relatives had. But when I got my first paycheck, I was surprised to see that I was being paid the minimum wage, even though other workers made more than that when they started. People not even in the family were getting paid a lot more than that. I brought my concern about the low pay I was receiving to my uncle, who at first defended the pay rate, then blamed it on a clerical error, and later on a decision made by my aunt. Over the next 2 years, I had to have several uncomfortable conversations about the value I brought to the company as I became more skilled. I was able to get a raise of nearly $5 in 2 years, but I had to fight for every single penny of it. One day I was carrying buckets of setting material called fat mud up a ladder that was leaning against the scaffold when the scaffold shifted and I slipped off the ladder. My right leg got caught between two ladder rungs and I was hanging upside down by the bend of my knee and later by my foot. Eventually I shook loose and I fell down onto the red mud. I called my uncle that evening and told him what had happened. Though I was able to walk, my leg didn't feel right, and I was concerned that there could be permanent damage to my knee. The knee is okay now, but still sometimes I can hear it like pop when I walk. When I asked my uncle to set up an appointment with a doctor, he got extremely angry. He cursed me, threatened me, and he told me to quit. My future health and well-being were much less important to my uncle than the fact that he would have to pay for a doctor's visit and that his workers' compensation premiums could rise. The experiences that my father and I had in the so-called family business taught me quite a lot about money and power, but they also taught me quite a lot about right and wrong. I've carried those experiences with me everywhere I've gone, and I've tried to help other workers get the most out of their efforts by teaching them about their rights. Over the last 15 years, I've mostly been employed at seafood processing plants, meat packing plants, and factories. I've worked in hourly positions doing repetitive work, but I've found ways to use what I know and what I'm good at for the benefit of my fellow employees. In 2007-2008, I was vocal about wage and hour issues that were leaving seafood processing workers, most of whom were J-1 visa holders from Eastern Europe, with less money than they had rightly earned. And some of those people are the ones who invited me to speak at the university that I mentioned earlier in Ukraine. From 2009 to 2014, I was an activist member of United Food and Commercial Workers, Local 2, and served as a union steward for most of that time. And sometimes I would be pulled off the line to work for the union. But most of that time I was basically a volunteer. Since I spoke Spanish, I was able to adequately represent my fellow employees when issues arose on the production floor. I gained a reputation for being someone who would help anyone at any time. Just as important, I became a source for accurate and reliable information about work issues by teaching my coworkers about their rights as employees and union members. From 2016 to 2018, I was a supervisor at a seafood processing plant in Dutch Harbor, Alaska. I was in charge of all aspects of the operation of a department, including the supervision of 65 employees. I found that maintaining the equipment and sanitizing the production area was much easier than balancing my ethical responsibility to meet my employer's expectation of me, while at the same time respecting the rights of employees and creating the best work environment possible for them. I freely admit that I was an imperfect leader, but I'm proud to say that the people who worked in my area knew that I respected them and that I always tried to do the right thing. In 2018, after taking a long vacation in Nicaragua, Nicaragua, and Mexico, I moved to Green Bay, Wisconsin, and accepted an hourly job as a saw operator at a meat packing plant. On the production floor, I was very vocal about safety issues, wage and hour concerns, and general working conditions. I encouraged union leaders to be more observant about the way the company treated its employees and urged them to enforce the collective bargaining agreement. The collective bargaining agreement is just a sheet of paper if it's not enforced, and that was my point that I kept bringing up over and over, that they say we have certain rights, but if we're not actually enforcing them, then we don't really have those rights. The union deferred to the company on nearly all matters in order to save money, increase efficiency, and avoid the stresses of conflict. Just before the onset of the pandemic in 2020, I settled a number of grievances and accepted a monetary payment in exchange for tendering my resignation voluntarily. The company had been retaliating against me for speaking out about issues at work, informing my coworkers about their rights, and organizing my coworkers to improve conditions for everyone in the plant. There was something that Professor Desai mentioned earlier, where a lot of times the companies like to separate people and they just want to settle one person's claim and let it not affect other people. And that's something that I saw a lot in the plants. They don't want to have to pay 2,000 people or 3,000 people, $500. They just want to pay that one guy. They want to make him sign the confidentiality agreement and then, keep him quiet. Now I want to give everyone some background information about the packing plants and what it's like to work there. Then I will focus on what happened during the pandemic and why we should all be concerned about it. Some of the major players in the meatpacking industry are National Beef, Cargill, Tyson, JBS, Smithfield, American Foods, Purdue, Sanderson Farms, and Hormel. It sounds like there's a lot of companies, but really there aren't. For example, in the beef industry, there are 4 major companies, and they control something like it's around 89% or something like that of the whole industry. So there isn't much left for everybody else, for the smaller players. The majority of the production workers in the industry are immigrants. Typically, there are workers from dozens of countries, and a dozen or more languages can be heard spoken on a daily basis within the plant. Some are educated but lack the language skills to find employment in their field in the United States. Others have limited or no formal education. Everyone is different, but there are a lot of people who, almost all of them come here for economic reasons, but some also come as refugees because wherever they're from in Africa or in Asia, mostly, it's too dangerous for them to live there anymore, so they come here. Packing plants are generally found in small towns or cities that are surrounded by farming and ranching communities. Often the packing plants are the largest employers and the economic engines that keep small towns alive. Here in Green Bay, the packing plants and their workers have been a vital part of the local economy for around 120 years. Incidentally, you can tell your friends that a real-life Green Bay Packer spoke to your law clinic and you won't be lying. They might imagine that you heard from Brett Favre or Aaron Rodgers, and you don't have to tell them that they're wrong. The Packers get all the football Packers get all the glory, but the meat Packers, the namesake of the team, produce products that end up on dinner plates all around the world. In order to feed the world and be profitable, the plants require workers to perform tasks repetitively and quickly. The workers perform the same task over and over all day, every day. There's a lot of pressure coming from high above for the supervisors to meet production goals. The supervisors have to push their employees very hard in order to meet expectations and keep their bosses off of their backs. Very often, the supervisors cut corners and ignore safety issues in order to keep production flowing. Production is their main focus because production determines profit. The supervisors don't do enough to stop injuries from occurring either because it isn't their priority. Just going back one sentence, Production determines profit, but it also determines their bonus. So that's why the supervisors are so concerned about production. The instead of removing hazards to workers and thus making the workplace safer, companies point their fingers at workers when there's an injury. Every company in the U.S. has a safety policy and safety slogans. It's actually, as you may know, required through through OSHA that all companies have to have something called process safety management. So basically, that's like the safety program, and so just about every company that you could possibly work for in the country has some sort of safety plan. If you walk into any plant, I guarantee you that you will see a sign that says something like "Safety first." Safety is our number one priority. Safety is job number one. Or our employees are our most valuable asset. The problem is that there's often a disconnect between the safety policy and slogans and what actually happens on a daily basis. Workers who are vocal about safety issues can face retaliation from their supervisors and lose their jobs. COVID-19 first showed up on most of our radars in January or February of 2020. By March, it was clear that it was going to be an issue that affected everyone across the globe. Some companies, government entities, and organizations did a better job than others in preparing for the arrival of the virus. One industry that was in the spotlight during the first year of the pandemic was the meatpacking industry because companies in the industry generally failed at protecting their workers. Evidence of that is that there were large outbreaks at plants across the country. At a pork plant in South Dakota, more than 700 people tested positive for coronavirus. At a poultry plant in North Carolina, my home state, nearly 600 employees tested positive. At the flagship JBS plant in Greeley, Colorado, hundreds of employees tested positive and 8 died. Here in Green Bay, JBS and American Foods each had hundreds of employees who tested positive for the virus. Dozens of employees at Salm Partners in Denmark also tested positive. The actual number of infections and deaths is unknown because most companies stopped reporting the numbers out of embarrassment, and they stopped doing the contact tracing because they knew that the tracing would lead back to the plant, and then they would have to let workers stay home. The companies didn't want the public to know how many people had been infected, but I think we had a right to know because it was a public health issue that affected everyone. So the question is, why did so many people in the plants test positive, and who's to blame? Inside the plants, the production flow is like an assembly line. Every job leads to the next job. But in this case, the workers are cutting an animal carcass apart instead of putting a product together. Most of the workers work side by side with their coworkers. In some cases, they brush each other or almost touch. When they go to break, they're face to face with their coworkers while they're doffing and donning their equipment. In the break room, there could be 500 or more people. There could be 50 or more people in the bathroom. There could be 50 or more people in the hallway. In the locker rooms, workers could be inches away from their coworkers when they put on and take off their hard hats and boots each day. The fact that workers are commonly in tight quarters with other people created the opportunity for the virus to spread. Also, the breaks are really short, which sometimes leads employees to skip certain sanitary practices in order to avoid getting in trouble for arriving late. And I'm sorry to tell you that, but because I'm sure that if you eat meat, then you'll likely be eating products from one of these plants pretty soon. But it's a fact. It happens. The companies in the meatpacking industry knew or should have known that the coronavirus pandemic was a threat to the health and safety of their workforce. They should have taken action immediately in order to protect their workers. Generally speaking, they did too little, too late. That lack of action caused more than 5,000 workers, at least, to get sick and dozens of deaths. The take action is because of greed, plain and simple. The companies make money by processing as much product as they can, as quickly as they can, and by cutting associated costs by any means necessary. In this case, the companies didn't want to spread out workers and decrease chain speeds. They didn't want to increase break lengths to give employees more time to wash their hands and equipment. They didn't want to stagger breaks to decrease the number of workers in the break rooms, bathrooms, locker rooms, and common areas. They didn't want to provide face shields, masks, hand sanitizer, or protective equipment in work areas. They waited too long to start checking temperatures and testing for the virus. They put too much pressure on employees to work while sick. Those decisions not to act caused the spread of the coronavirus in the plants. The companies are clearly to blame for the outbreaks at the plants. If they would have taken action sooner, we wouldn't have seen all the headlines. Their decision to procrastinate caused thousands of people to get sick and led to many, many deaths. Just to be fair, the government and the unions get to share some of the blame. The Trump administration from the beginning supported the industry's goal of staying open no matter what. The plants and the workers were deemed essential to the food supply chain. They are and they always have been, but if the health and safety of the workers had been at the forefront, the situation could have been avoided. It's important to point out that OSHA gave exactly 0 citations to companies for health and safety violations related to the coronavirus pandemic until the situation was under better control in the fall of 2020. The companies had no reason to be afraid of punishment by the government because the government sat on its hands and did nothing. After JBS shut down temporarily, OSHA opened an investigation that appeared likely to go nowhere and do nothing. And that's exactly what happened. It looked like a face-saving operation to give the illusion that the Trump administration had taken action. OSHA was created to keep workers safe and healthy, but it failed to do that during the pandemic. Ultimately, JBS USA, the parent company, paid a fine of $14,502 to settle the citations against its plants in Green Bay and Greeley, Colorado. Around April 2020, the CDC released guidelines about how companies should respond to the coronavirus threat in order to protect their employees. The problem is that the CDC guidelines were merely recommendations. The companies got to decide whether or not to implement them. This means that a company could decide that the guidelines were too expensive to implement, that they weren't feasible, or that they weren't necessary. Some companies complied more than others. So instead of having one standard that all companies around the country had to follow, we had kind of like a patchwork because some companies really complied and others didn't. So, your outcomes were different based on that compliance. The companies that chose not to fully implement the guidelines were putting their businesses, their employees, and the general public at risk. What we needed were enforceable regulations that would ensure that all companies were playing by the same rules and that doing everything they could to protect workers and the public. Most of the packing plants in the U.S. are located in small cities and towns surrounded by rural areas. They are often the largest source of revenue for local governments. It seems that some local governments were hesitant to create tension with the companies by asserting authority. Instead, they waited for the state or federal government to intervene. By waiting, they missed an opportunity to quickly and effectively take action to protect their communities. It was almost like a game of hot potato because all the different agencies were trying to suddenly give authority to other agencies when normally it's the other way around. Normally they're fighting for authority, but in this case they were saying, this is not our problem, this is not us, this is someone else. And so they were passing the potato around. The unions have the obligation to defend the rights of their members and protect their health and safety. Instead, the unions, namely UFCW and its local unions, allowed the companies to operate however they wanted and didn't do what was necessary to protect their members. The union leaders chose to maintain cordial relationships with the companies and stable finances over workers' health and safety. The unions waited until their members were sick to start putting out meaningless press releases. Union leaders are supposed to serve as the voice of working people, but they were almost all silent when their voice was needed most. If the unions were more organized and engaged, they would have had more power and could have forced the companies to act sooner, which could have saved union members from getting sick and in some cases dying. Some companies have tried to put the blame on workers, but that's just a cop-out. There are things that workers could have done to protect themselves, like following safety rules at work and CDC guidelines at home, but ultimately the workplace is only as safe as the companies make it. The outbreaks at the plants have exposed how the companies operate and how workers are affected by corporate greed. They've shed light on how laws, regulations, policies, and politics keep government agencies from doing what's in the best interest of workers. It's also become more obvious that strong unions with engaged and organized members are needed now more than ever. We needed companies to act responsibly, government officials to put the well-being of workers ahead of their big money special interest, and union leaders to take a strong stand in defense of workers, but we didn't get any of that. The workers at the plants are vital to our economy and our community. They spend money in stores, buy their own homes, and raise their families here. The workers, most of whom are immigrants, enrich our community in every way. It's really important that we show solidarity by making them feel welcome and appreciated. Language barriers can make it difficult to communicate our values directly, but we can show them how we feel through our actions. In May of 2020, the Chief Justice of the Wisconsin Supreme Court made a statement that I found disrespectful to people who work in the plants. She drew a contrast between plant workers and regular folks. It sounded to me like she was making an allusion to the fact that many plant workers are immigrants who aren't affluent. The fact of the matter is that the people who work in the plants live in our community just like everyone else. We're directly connected to them as they are connected to us. COVID-19 spread quickly in the plants, and pretty soon it was spreading everywhere else in our community because the workers go to stores, dine in restaurants, play at parks, attend church, seek healthcare services, and send their children to local schools. We needed to stand up for the plant workers because it was the right thing to do for them, but it would have benefited everyone else in the community to do that and more because, as we saw, doing basically nothing led to more people in the community getting sick and passing away, and all of us having to pay the direct and indirect costs associated with that. Even if you weren't a plant worker, you were indirectly affected by the lack of action to protect plant workers. There aren't very many food processing plants in southern Arizona, but there are workers in a wide variety of industries that are at risk of being taken advantage of, mistreated, abused, or otherwise harmed. You may have already come across landscapers, construction workers, restaurant workers, hotel workers, warehouse workers, factory workers, healthcare workers, and others who are vulnerable and have been harmed by their employers. We may not have close personal ties to these people, but we need to be willing to stand up for them when they need us most. As we all know, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. became one of the most important leaders our country and the world has ever produced. I'm no presidential historian, but I would venture to say that Dr. King's time as a civil rights leader was more consequential than the presidencies of a great many of our chief executives. I mean, there's no Millard Fillmore Day. There's no Franklin Pierce Day. When is James Buchanan Day? There isn't one, right? I digress. Getting back to Dr. King, he went to college at age 15 and graduated with a PhD at age 26. He was a minister of a church in Montgomery, Alabama at the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, 1955. Though he had a wife and children at home, he took a prominent role in the movement locally, then throughout the South, and later nationally. He was beaten and bloodied countless times. His family was threatened and his house was bombed. He was jailed 29 times for nonviolent civil disobedience. On one of those occasions from the Birmingham City Jail, he wrote a now famous letter that included a passage with these lines: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. King was explaining why he came to Birmingham to protect the rights of people who weren't from his community and whom he didn't know. He could have declined a role in the movement early on and stayed in Montgomery with his wife and 4 little kids. He could have focused on his ministerial duties and tended to his flock at the church. He could have had a quiet, comfortable, happy, and safe life, but he realized that if he wasn't willing to stand up and do the right thing, maybe no one would be. Dr. King is most closely associated with the civil rights movement, but he was also a critic of the Vietnam War and a powerful advocate for workers' rights. The evening before Dr. King was assassinated, he spoke in support of striking waste management or sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. Our country and all of our people are better for the fact that he chose to use the power of his voice to make the plight of others known. Few people, if anyone, will be able to have the kind of impact on the lives of others that Dr. King had. We won't be able to do what he did, but we should use his story to inspire ourselves to act when action is needed. By the way, if you ever are anywhere near Memphis, you should stop and visit the National Civil Rights Museum. It's basically right there in downtown Memphis. As you enter, you literally stand between where the shooter fired from and where Dr. King fell on that balcony at the Lorraine Motel. It's still there, and it's kind of part of the museum. Though you can't enter it, but you're right there at it. The museum reminded me of how far we've come and how far we have to go. I'm told that everyone in this clinic has the desire to serve underrepresented communities and protect the rights of workers. There might be other students in the law school who don't see the benefit of spending time and effort to protect workers' rights. Since they're educated and likely headed to successful careers in a well-paid profession, they might not think that what happens to low-wage workers affects them. I'm glad that you all understand the importance of standing up for and standing with workers who might be different from you in many ways and engaged in occupations that are much different than the one you have chosen. Workers in this country are struggling to keep their footing and move forward. There are so many powerful forces working against them. Workers need advocates that are talented, skilled, smart, creative, and knowledgeable, just like you are. Most importantly, they need advocates who have the morality, integrity, courage, conviction, and tenacity that you do. I hope that no matter what path you take on your legal journey, you don't forget how it made you feel to seek justice for your clients in this clinic. More importantly, I hope you don't forget the sense of empowerment that your clients got from knowing that they had someone on their side in the fight for justice. And I'm sure you've seen it, but on your website, on the Workers' Rights Clinic website, there's this short video about the women who were janitorial workers. And that video touched me because you saw in just a short amount of time how they changed. And at one point, one lady, I can't remember her name and I apologize for that, but she said that going through that experience made her feel like she was somebody. And we're all somebody, but sometimes we need someone else to remind us of that and to empower us, to help us be everything that we can be. And that's what you all have the opportunity to do, and that's what you're doing actually. And so I commend you for that, for sure. Thank you for your time and all that you do. Solidarity.
Garrett, I have tears in my eyes. I mean, that was so moving and really inspiring. Thank you so much for taking the time to put all of that together and tie together so many different threads and elements. I could just go on and on, but I don't want to, because I want to open it up for students to ask you questions or ask about your thoughts, because you clearly are exactly what we're reading and talking about when we talk about movement lawyering. So, all right, next question. Thoughts, comments? Yeah,
Question.
Elliot has a question.
I'm not sure exactly how many courses you've taken or what you've taken in particular, but I'm curious about how your experience has informed learning about the law and what your impressions are of legal work so far.
Thank you for the question. So the law is something that I've been fascinated with my whole life. And over these times that the last 15, 20 years that I've been working, I have been taking all sorts of courses, whether they be for credit or not for credit, just because I want to learn everything that I can. And I've also, you know, how every business has those posters that have all your rights written on there for the NLRB or the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act, and all these different acts and stuff. Well, I would actually go and read those while everyone else was like, walking through the hallway, because they always put it in a busy place where you can't stop and read it. And so I would go there and read it, and people would say, hey, what are you doing? And I would say, I'm learning about our rights. And they would say, why? And I would say, because I'm going to protect them. And so, it's important. And I said it several times. I'm not a lawyer. I don't think I am. I don't try to be one. But I try to learn as much about the law, because even if you're not a lawyer and you don't like lawyers, you still need to know about the law because you're affected by it. And so I think that all people should be taking law courses if they can, or finding resources that teach them about the law. And so that's how I've kind of approached that.
That's wonderful. We could really benefit from lawyers like you, though, just so you know. Connor has a question, and Connor's worked with unions.
Yeah. Hey, Jared. Nice to meet you. I'm Connor back here. So I'm curious. There's been a shift in a lot of unions moving away from cozying up to power towards, a lot of elections going towards reformers. I know UFCW is quite notorious for cozying up to power. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what the rank and file did to voice that displeasure and hopefully transition the union to a more just and democratic union.
Oh man, this could be a topic. Maybe I'll send you my email, because I would like to talk all about this. I love this topic. So basically, what happens is, in the unions, the people who are in charge sometimes kind of separate themselves from the union, and it's easier in the bigger unions because you're farther away from the people. Just like in government, the people who are in Washington D.C. making the laws are often very much separated from us. So it's harder for us to influence them. But the people who are at the state level, they still live in our communities. We might see them around. So it's easier for us to communicate. And so in the smaller local unions, you might work beside the union president, because he's not a full-time employee of the union. He's a regular worker just like you. So you can talk to him and explain to him whatever you think, and you can have more influence because he's right there beside you. So that's kind of a big deal, a big part of that. And I've been very vocal, both locally at my local unions and all the way up to the president of UFCW, Mark Perone, and a lot of the other people who are at the national, or they call it international headquarters in Washington, D.C. I've had a lot of conversations with them, and they haven't enjoyed it. But I have probably more so, because I think it's really important that they understand what the rank and file members think, because it's our union. It's not their union. It's the union of all the people. Just like a government is supposed to be of the people, by the people, and for the people, the union is supposed to be the same way. And so I try to remind them of that they're not there for their benefit. They're there to serve, and they really don't like hearing that, but that's the way it is. And so I've always tried to encourage workers to know about their union, to know about the processes, all the I'm going to run out of battery here, but to know about the processes, and to know how things work, so that they can make the union the way that they want it to be. So we want democracy inside the union, so that it's the people deciding which direction the union goes. And that's an uphill battle. It's tough because it's really, inside baseball, it's real technical kind of stuff that, a lot of people just aren't prepared to understand just yet. I mean, they will be able to at some point, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to explain those things.
Thank you, Jarrett. Leah Jaffe, who's also on Zoom, who's a supervisor in the clinic, and before she came to us, was a supervising attorney she was attorney and supervising attorney for like 30 years at the National Labor Relations Board. So Leah's got a question. Oh, Leah, you're on mute.
So I just want to follow up on Connor's question a little bit because it was a really good one. Do you think that I believe Wisconsin has a right to work law, and do you think that contributed at all to the union's passivity? And do you know what percentage of the employees at the plant you worked at were union members?
Okay, at the plant that I worked at in Wisconsin, all of them were, because the right to work law had a grandfather clause. I don't know if that's the exact right phrase, but it allowed the current contract to expire, and it was a long contract. So even though the right to work law was signed a long time ago, all of the workers were required to be members until I think it was just like a year or two ago. But the UFCW is really good at internal organizing, or not internal organizing, external organizing, like bringing people into the union, especially when they come into the plant. They kind of have a captive audience, and they're able to kind of really pressure them into joining the union. But they don't do such a good job at internal organizing, so helping people inside the union be informed and making sure there's transparency and making sure that people know that it's their union and that they can be part of it and that they can voice their concerns and all this kind of stuff. So that's kind of how it separates.
Why do you think then that the union was so passive, aside from the fact that the International is a big union? Do you think it's corruption, or do you think it was a bad contract, a weakness, the union didn't have any bargaining power? What do you attribute their passivity to?
So there's a couple different reasons. One of the main ones is the money. So in order to fight a company like JBS, I don't know exactly how much money they have now, but let's say it's like $50 billion. So JBS has $50 billion, and the UFCW Local 1473 has $1 million in the bank. They don't want to blow their whole $1 million on attorneys. Or I should say spend, because we're amongst attorneys. They don't want to spend. They don't want to spend their whole $1 million on attorneys, only to lose. And so what they've kind of figured out is that there's a way of doing business where they can kind of get along with the companies. They can have continuous stable income from the employees, and they kind of talk about what they're struggling for, but they're not actually struggling. They're not actually doing anything. They're, talking a lot, but not doing much. And they also, in some of our contracts, almost all of them, there's a no strike clause. So the strike is the most powerful tactic that we have, because if you strike, the company stops producing, right? And so there's no strike clauses that we're basically giving away our leverage. And then another thing, there's like in some contracts, there are these agreements that the company can't say anything negative about the union, and that's actually also part of the NLRB that they or NLRA, but they also have agreements where the companies can't say things that sound negative about, or the unions can't say things that sound negative about the companies. And so for me, I kind of mentioned it earlier, I've always used the media and social media in order to get the word out, because you need as much support as you can get from wherever you can get it when you're trying to take on either a union or a company. And but the unions aren't allowed to use those sources. So in some cases, depending on the exact words that they want to use, but uh, they're afraid to have conflict, because ultimately conflict is costly.
Yeah. Other questions? Come, yeah, Isai in the back there has a question.
I was just wondering if you have any recommendations or thoughts on ways that students that might be graduating from the clinic, including myself, can and be show solidarity with workers, even though in our legal careers it might take us through different paths. That's obviously very different than the work we're doing here.
And by the way, Isai is going to go on and graduate and work for the National Labor Relations Board in Phoenix.
Oh wow, that's interesting. So one thing you can do is something that you already do in this clinic, which is go to the public and talk to them and teach them and explain things to them and be open to their questions, and be open to helping them understand how things work, because it's complicated, and a lot of folks don't have the time to devote to it like I have, like I've made for myself, and so they're just not informed. So go to the public, whether that be through your job, which I commend you for doing that, because um, uh, the federal government and the state governments too just don't have the resources to really do what's necessary. There's actually a lot of vacancies, so in some places there is no attorney, right? And that's a big problem. But so go out to the public, whether you do it through your job, or I know some attorneys who have started local radio shows in Spanish or in English, and they talk about legal issues, not just employment, but also immigration, or how to deal with the water company or whatever. And that helps people become more comfortable with the law, and it also helps them identify with an attorney, and kind of creates trust with the community, because they can listen to these people, and they kind of get to know them, even though it's just through the radio waves. And then I've known other attorneys who will ask to borrow some space from the library on a Saturday. They'll print some flyers, invite the community. They'll make a little presentation for 10-15 minutes about something in the law that they think is important, and then they'll just take questions. And I think that's important too, because people can pretty much do the same things that I was just talking about. Get to have trust with an attorney, even if it's not a attorney-client relationship. You're still being able to talk about issues that are important, and I think that's a good way to do that. And just have discussions. So like if there's a labor breakfast, or if the union's having some event, or if you're driving down Speedway and you see some people out in front of the supermarket with signs, park your car and go stand with them, talk to them, ask them what's going on, and support them. If they have a bucket that they're collecting money, throw $10-$20 in there, and just show them that you're a supporter, and that you'll be with them. Even if you don't give your services away, or you can't, probably in your case, I don't know if you can. But yeah, just in whatever way you feel comfortable, I say, get in where you fit in, and just support any way that you're okay with.
That is such a terrific response to that question, Jared. I wish that we could broadcast that at the law school, because I think there are so many students that have that question, because we really do want to be of service, but law school doesn't really teach you how to do that. So thank you so much for those thoughts. They're so helpful. Other questions? I think we have time for maybe one more question, if anybody has a question or a comment.
I guess I have more of a comment. I guess I just wanted to say thank you, because I guess I can only speak for myself. I've like other people feel the same way. Like it's easy to get like maybe a little jaded or like bogged down. So like hearing you talk was really inspiring, and I was also crying at the end. So thank you for coming to talk with us, and thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you for having me. One thing that I was kind of thinking of, kind of in regards to the last question, and it's kind of related to this question too, is that, you know, when I was involved in all these different disputes or different struggles, it was very lonely. And even if I had other people who were supporting me, you know, when a lot of the pressure is on you, it makes you feel lonely. So for me, it would have been good, even if I didn't have an attorney to talk to in the, you know, with an attorney client relationship, just to have someone to like bounce ideas off. You know, go walk on a Saturday morning or go meet at the coffee shop and just talk to them and just have support from them, and you know, be able to hear them say, "Hey, Jared, we know you're doing a good thing. Keep on doing it, and we're here for you." Even if they're not giving me legal advice and they're not providing services to me, just to have that kind of support is empowering in the same way that you, the people in that video empowered those janitorial workers. So thank you for the.
Jared, I don't know if you're familiar with the Association for Union Democracy, but they have attorneys and people who help union dissidents move their unions toward greater democracy.
Yes, thank you for that. I've been in contact with them pretty frequently, and I always send them. You know, when I read an op-ed or I have something that I think is important, I always forward it to them. And I also use a lot of their material too and try to learn from that, because they have some people who have been around for a long time, even before I was born, you know, fighting in this, fighting to make unions more democratic. So that's definitely true. Thank you.
And although we don't have the privilege, we're not fortunate enough to have you here in Tucson, I think many of us would gladly take a virtual walk or have a virtual coffee with you at any point. If you're interested, you know, you can always reach out to me, Jarrett. I want to echo what Grace, and I think I can just tell everyone's just riveted during your talk, and that is not always the case when we have guest speakers. So I just, you're a powerhouse. You're a tremendous force. And we are, I think, all so grateful that you're there doing your work, but we want to be able to walk alongside you and everyone else who's doing the kind of work that you're doing. So let's keep doing that. And I just can't thank you enough for all of the time and effort you put into coming and speaking with us today. It's very intentional, and really, we learned so much.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was an absolute honor. It's something that I'm going to remember for a long time, even though it wasn't in person like I had kind of hoped. And it's going to be something that is a highlight of my MLS journey. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I wish all of you well. I know that you'll do well because you have great professors like Professor Desai. So you're going to be prepared. You're going to go out there and you're going to do whatever it is that you need to do to have a great career. And I look forward to seeing you do that. So thank you very much.
And let's be in touch. I'll be in touch with you afterwards.
Definitely. I have a few ideas that I want to share with you, so I'll do that through email very shortly.
Wonderful. That sounds perfect. Thank you, Jared. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.